Is the camera running?
Uh-huh.
It is really.
So, your mom got started with paleontology in 1917, huh?
Yeah, I was thinking about how all of this got started, and my family actually homesteaded in this part of the country in 1913. Same year that Eugene Stebbinger found the first dinosaur bone in this particular part of the country. And in 1917, my mother was 5 years old, she found her first dinosaur bone. And the way that came about was, back in those days, we didn't have the ability to get rid of problems in cattle like we do today. You know, the flies and things that attack cows during the hot summer months are now controlled with oilers and things that they can rub on. But back then, the only way they had to get rid of the parasites was to dip the cattle, which meant running them through a pool of water that had a film of creosote poured over the top of it. So it was kind of a messy job. You had to run the cow into the tank, and then you had to push her head and make sure the body all got covered, and then they come back out.
Mm-hmm.
Well, those tanks were few and far between. So, you know, there wasn't one on every property. In fact, there was only one in this part of the country. It was up by the Bynum Reservoir, and you had to trail the cattle up to what they called the dipping vat.
Mm-hmm.
And when Mother was 5 years old, she was, for her birthday, given her very first horse. And because she had a horse, she was allowed to trail the cattle up to the dipping vat. She wasn't allowed to dip them because 5-year-olds and cattle that are
Freaked out?
Don't get along too well. So there was a ranch foreman that was pretty much her father figure, if you will, that was quite a cowboy in his own right. He drove freight wagon from Fort Shaw to Fort McLeod back in the early days, and he rode with Charlie Russell and all of that. Anyway, he was the person who was in charge of the ranch and actually dipping the cows. So this day came along when it was time to perform this task, and they trailed the cows up to the dipping vats, and when they got there, Bob, that was the foreman's name, told Mother that she wasn't allowed to help dip, but you know, she could go over the hillside there and look for pretty rocks or whatever, and when they're done dipping the cattle, she'll help trail them back home. And that's what happened. And of course, when the dipping and trailing was all done, Bob looked at her and said, "So did you find any pretty rocks?" And she pulled out her finds out of her pockets, and he immediately picked one out of there, and he said, "You know what this is? This is a piece of fossilized bone. This is something that used to be bone, but it's turned to stone, and it's from a prehistoric animal." And that set the stage for her interest in fossils from then till the day she died. Mm-hmm. And of course, fast forward that till I would say late 1900s, but that would be lying. 1950s, 60s. And her own boy is in the same age and interested in fossils, and so we went fossil hunting from the time I can remember. The fossils that we found were generally fragments. That's pretty much what you find. Mm-hmm. But that all changed in 1971. We were out for an afternoon day off, if you will, and one of my mother and my favorite things once I got old enough was to jump on the back of my motorcycle and putt across the prairie and look for whatever was lying around there. My mother and by extension myself were raised on horseback. She loved her horses. And from the time I could remember, the thing you did, regardless of what you were doing out there, it was always from horseback. But when I was 15 years old or so, I bought a motorcycle. And I liked the motorcycle because you don't have to feed it, you don't have to brush it, you don't have to take care of it other than put some gas and oil in it, and it's closer to the ground. So it's easier to see things. So it got to be that Mother would get on the back of my motorcycle and we'd put off across the prairie rather than getting on the back of a horse and riding across the prairie.
But did your motorcycle love you?
No, there was always that, some motorcycles others seem to hate me pretty bad over the years. That's a whole nother story. But anyway,
looking for dinosaurs.
We were out up by the Bynum Reservoir this nice summer day in '71, putting along, and saw this little ledge of sandstone just poking out of the prairie grass. And I noticed a dinosaur bone fragment lying along the edge of the rock layer. Mm-hmm. And so we stopped and got to looking around, and there were a couple of great big chunks of this rock layer, and then there was a little chunk off to the end. And there wasn't much actually in the line of fossil fragments laying around. There were just a couple. But I rolled the little chunk over on the end, and there's bones, articulated bones embedded in the rock. And I instantly knew that, after all the years of wandering and looking and seeing nothing but fragments, we had finally found a part of a dinosaur, something that was
identifiable,
recognizable. Yep, exactly. And of course, my mother and Dad had collected quite a number of things, and we had a case or two in the shop. They ran this little rock shop here in Bynum, and in the back of the shop there was a little area that was not for sale, things that had been discovered over the years. And we decided that this would be one of those pieces, whatever it was, because it was actually eroding out and falling apart, and we knew if we left it, it would be gone in a few years. So we managed to roll the blocks over them. Actually, my stepbrother and I, we went back and got him. He wasn't much interested in fossils, but he did like a challenge. So we took our little Jeep pickup and managed to four-wheel it down into where this block of rocks were. And we managed to load those two great big chunks of rock containing all these articulated bones and the little chunk that I could pick up myself. And we brought them back and put preservative on them and set them up for display. But of course, when you find something like that, the first question is exactly what is it? So as soon as we could, my mother and I arranged a trip over the entire state of Montana. We went to Glendive, and we went to Malta, and we went to Glasgow, and we went to Jordan, and everywhere we had heard that had dinosaurs in museums. And
was Museum of the Rockies doing dinosaurs at that point?
It was not. Museum of the Rockies at that point was a little local history museum in a Quonset hut. I think. I'm trying to remember. Yeah, it was just, yeah, that was what it was. Anyway, the trip around was a real eye-opener for us. We saw a skull of a Triceratops in Jordan, but the only dinosaur on display was in the little town of Ekalaka, clear at the other end of the state, at the end of, at that time, a gravel road. And it was in their county museum in the basement of their high school. And it had been put together by a couple of ranchers like we were. Mm-hmm. And what that made us understand was all of the books and papers that I had read about dinosaurs and the wonderful discoveries here in Montana were all about people who had come and discovered but left nothing behind.
Just out of curiosity, what was the dinosaur in Ekalaka?
It was an animal that was at that time called Anatosaurus.
Okay.
And that name has since gone away. It was called Anatotitan for a while, and now they refer to it just as Edmontosaurus annectens.
Okay.
But it was a type specimen for. It's an unusual type of duck-billed dinosaur. So, anyway, the more we traveled, the more irritated we got, because this just isn't right. You know, there should be something to see where something important has been found. I mean, it would be like taking Roswell and packing up and move it to New York City.
We're taking all the mummies out of Egypt.
We're taking all the mummies out of Egypt. All the mummies. You know, don't leave even one back there. So we decided that if there's a little museum in Ekalaka, Montana that can put together a dinosaur and have one on display, there's a little museum in Bynum that could put together a dinosaur and have one on display. So that really started us making. We turned away at that point from having just a couple of cases and things that had not for sale tags on them, to actually separating off a section of the shop and labeling it, this is a museum. Nothing here is for sale. This is our own local history discoveries and natural history discoveries. You know. So we actually got serious about looking for stuff to display at that point. And you like the story about motorcycles. In 1977, I went over to Conrad to Bliss Cycle Sales and walked into a guy I knew, bought several motorcycles from before. Told him that we had just gotten permission to look on some neighbor's land that was several miles away, and my little motorcycle just would not carry Mother and I that far effectively, and I needed something larger because, you know, we like to go hunting for dinosaurs, and you know, that was the ultimate thing, was motorcycle to put along and look for. And he sold me this really nice Kawasaki 350 motorcycle, and Mother and I got on it and putted around, and we actually found what we were looking for. At least we thought we did. We found a hillside with dinosaur bones sticking out of the hill, and what was sticking out was a piece of a couple of the leg bones, a tibia and a fibula, and what I thought was part of a femur and some rib bones. We thought we had our dinosaur to stand up, and so we started digging on it.
Mm-hmm. Now, at this point, did you have any idea what geologic formation you were digging in, or any idea of the context, the age, or anything?
I did. At that time, of course, there is no internet.
Uh-huh.
But I read everything that was in print pretty much at that time. I had become the ultimate paleo geek from that generation, and that was weird because back then, it wasn't every kid's dream to become a paleontologist. It was you were one of the weird kids at that point, if that was it. But
no, there wasn't any Jurassic Park phase or anything.
no, actually, if you read the original book, Jurassic Park was spawned by the discovery that we made at Shoto there. The very first place that Grant goes to find his dinosaur in the original Jurassic Park book is Snakebite, Montana, 15 miles east of Shoto, which is interesting because the site's about 15 miles west of Shoto, so it's right there.
It's closer to the airport.
There you go. So, anyway, we're really fairly serious, and of course, Mother being raised by this original area cowboy was taught to be quite the naturalist. When you're one of the originals in an area, you survive by understanding every little thing. Bob could walk out across prairie and tell you how many animals had gone across there in the past week in which direction, and not only what species they were, but how big they were, whether they were male or female. The guy was unbelievable. And so I can't remember a time when I wasn't being trained in those sorts of things. And of course, I'm not nearly the naturalist that my mother was in that respect. But I still knew the difference between a femur and a tibia by the time I was 4 years old, and things like that. So putting an animal together, recognizing what we were seeing, wasn't a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
Comparative anatomy, dinosaur skeletons and human skeletons and dog skeletons are, for 90% level, the same. It's just the minor differences that allow you to separate out what species or what it actually is.
I imagine you butchered quite a few animals in your time.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's part of growing up in the middle of nowhere, Montana. And yeah, we had to take our animals from birth to being beefsteak on the table, as well as other things. So yeah, we got our share of comparative anatomy as well. But anyway, when we found this site, that was, to me, my dream come true. However, it turns out it was not my mother's. My mother liked to go and look. Turns out she really did not like to dig. So
it's a little tedious out there in the sun.
it is. And the more you do it, the more tedious it can become.
Frustrating.
Especially when the bones are powdery and where you have to try to preserve as you go. If you lose something out there, if your powdered bone has a little windstorm blow that removes a part of it, you can't get that back.
Uh-huh.
So whatever you do at the start is going to determine what you end up with, because it's a one-way process. So, in all of my reading, there was at that time a chemical that was being used in the field and in the lab to preserve fossils called glyptol. And it was this stable plastic material that was supposed to be, what you use to preserve fossil bones.
Uh-huh.
But
is that the one that killed everybody?
I tried to get some because I knew we needed some sort of preservative. And I found out that they had just recalled all of it because it turns out that a lot of the professional fossil preparators were dying. because the stuff turned out to be this horrible carcinogen and liver destroyer that actually killed quite a number of people. So we didn't have, as paleontologists, anything to replace it at that time. So we had to revert back to what we had before Glyptol came along, and that was shellac. And yeah, here's this substance that's horrible, messy to work with, and it doesn't penetrate well, but at least it keeps the oxygen away, and it glues things together enough that the little breeze isn't going to blow your bone away. But the problem with shellac is it has to be recoated every year or two because it deteriorates rapidly. It's not a stable compound. But it's better than nothing, and it's what we had back then. That was all we had to work with. So, our job at that point became trying to get this dinosaur dug, assembled, and stood up in our little museum. And by that time I had actually met someone and gotten married, and my wife Lori and I and my mother would then go out and spend our evenings or weekend days or whatever doing the digging and recovering. And because it was so slow and tedious because of the limited chemicals and things, we have it so much nicer now. But anyway, it got to be a fair habit that we'd go out and dig for a couple hours, and then Mother would go and wander and leave us to finish whatever digging we were doing and put the site to bed and pack up the tools, and she'd meet us back at the vehicle. And this one evening, we are headed back to the vehicle, and here's Mother sitting on this little mound of dirt no higher than this table, and she's got this big smile on her face, and she says, "Look what I found." And she held up this little bitty dinosaur vertebra, obviously baby something or other. And you can tell babies from adults because baby bones are not well formed. You don't have the hard outside surface that grows.
They're kind of all the porous inside.
Yeah. All animals when they're first born are born with the spongy bone, and that's basically what bone is until you have a year or two of growth and develop the compact bone that coats the outside. So anyway, we were looking at that, and I was just really excited because not only was there a little vertebrae there, I picked up a little section of a jawbone, and I, again from knowing what I was reading and what have you, knew that we had a little piece of a jaw from a duck-billed dinosaur.
Because of the tooth rows in there?
It's the only animal that's built. The duck-billed dinosaurs were the most wonderful critters. They had the ultimate grinding apparatus in their jaws. The average animal, what we're accustomed to, the mammals, we have a couple sets of teeth, and when they fall out, we're all done. These dinosaurs had little rows of holes along the bottom of their jaw that new tooth buds could implant their entire lives. And these animals had up to 1,200 teeth in their mouth at any given time. And they would just keep growing teeth, and as they wore out old teeth, new ones would come in and replace them. But that creates this really interesting, what we call a dental battery that is unique in the animal kingdom. So when you see one of them, you pretty well know you've got a duck-billed dinosaur.
Now, don't ceratopsians have that too?
Ceratopsians have the same type of grinding apparatus, but the teeth shape and the teeth are double rooted instead of single rooted, and
Okay.
they look a lot different.
Okay. So baby duckbill jaw.
Baby duckbill jaw, and that was exciting because now not only we got an adult duckbill that we're going to be able to stand up, we've got maybe a baby duckbill that we can stand up next to it and show, because here's an animal that's this long, and here's an adult that's going to be in the 20-25 foot long range, and so we've got the entire growth range apparently, and so in the next couple weeks, well, other than a few rainstorms that kept us from getting out there, we spent every chance we could out there.
Mm-hmm. Now,
And
were you working on the adults still, or did you focus on the babies more?
we actually were working on both. I didn't find any place where the babies were coming out of the ground.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things that we discovered the hard way on that first site was, if you go to digging, before you pick up all of the pieces, the stuff you dig covers up those pieces and it makes it really hard to find them again. So it became, even at that time, my habit of surface collecting everything first and then dig. And of course you don't dig unless you see where something's sticking out and it tells you to dig here.
Uh-huh.
So at that time we were digging on the adults and we were surface collecting the baby bits. We were, each time we would go out there we would find another 10 or 15 baby bones.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was, we had somewhere upward of 200 baby bones collected midsummer of 1978 when these two guys walked into the shop and were looking around the museum, and one guy introduced himself as Jack Horner, and